Hello everyone, welcome back. As you can see, I have the Xbox Series S here, and I just opened this a month ago in an unboxing video, so, now's ripe old time to do a review on it. Yeah, I was going to give it about a week or two just to kind of test around, play some games, download some stuff, and, just get a wide picture of how the games run, how they look, how fast the system is, and then just kind of kept going and doing that and testing more and more games. And yeah, a month later, I'm finally back here doing the review of it. If you want the short and simple version, it's good. I like it. It's very nice. There are some drawbacks to it, which I will get into, but I mean, for a $300 console, really $250 if you don't include the controller. But I mean, it is just incredibly powerful for what it is. And as you can see in the back here, I have the 1 terabyte Seagate thing. If it'll focus in, see if it'll focus on that 1 terabyte. Come on now, focus. Get in there. Hey, there we go. 1 terabyte, there it is. Now, this thing is exorbitantly expensive for how small it is, which I'll go ahead and show you now. It is far smaller than I thought it would be. When you look at the reviews and stuff like that on the product page, look at this thing. This is 1 terabyte right here. It's pretty wacky, and it keeps going out of focus for some reason. Yeah, there we go. Look at that thing. Very, very small for what it does. But I will say, and it is kind of like a little bit redundant, because I would say if you were going to play the Series S and you're kind of just doing it casually, a few games here and there, the storage is fine as is. It's 500 gigabytes, but it's not really, because a lot of these companies that say 500, it's actually like 360 or something like that. So 360 gigabytes in the modern age, for me, as far as the Series X optimized games go, that has been roughly 10 games. And my storage device on top of that, I have a 5 terabyte external drive. That holds about 250 games. So you can see the discrepancy in how much this can hold versus the Series X or getting the little storage device in the back. And what I was going to say that is kind of redundant is if you were going to buy this and you want to play several Series X optimized games, I would definitely recommend getting that little storage device in the back. And you may be saying, well, if you're going to do that, the storage device is $220, the console's $300, why don't I just get a Series X? And the answer to that is, that's a good point. I mean, at some point, you might as well just get the Series X, but the only problem is, with the storage device and the Series S, it puts you up to 1.5 terabytes. If you get the Series X by itself, it's still just 1 terabyte. So you can get this with the memory for the same price as a 1 terabyte Series X, albeit it's a more powerful console. But if you want more than a terabyte, you're going to have to buy the external drive anyway. So for the Series X, it's going to be about $720, whereas this one would be $520 with the storage. If 1 terabyte, though, is fine, then you can just get the Series X without it, but I always like to have more games ready to go, which it definitely did make a difference. I was able to go from 10 Series S and X optimized games up to all of the ones that I had, which was about 30 or 40. So those are now all on the console. They're all on the little drive in the back. So storage side, let's talk about size. As you can see, this thing is incredibly small for a console, that is. Compared to other stuff, it might be a little bit bigger. There are some dictionaries bigger than this. So yeah, this can fit on a shelf, can fit out of the way, comparing it to the controller, that's how big it is. It's very small. So if you're getting it for the portability factor, that also comes into it. The Series X is almost about this high, but kind of like double wide and a little bit taller. But they're roughly the same size. So yeah, if that's part of the argument of what you're trying to find, whether you need a small console, big console, you don't care too much about 4K graphics, that all goes into making this purchase here. And again, going back to the buying the Series S and then putting the card in it, when you could just say, why not get the Series X? The problem is, right now at least, the Series X is much harder to find, which is why I got the Series S to begin with. So for right now, it's better just to get the Series S and get the little expansion drive. That way, when I do finally get a Series X and my constant clicking and refreshing finally works, then I'll just be able to take this drive and just push it right in the other one. So that could be the other argument. If you're planning on getting both, then it really doesn't matter because you're going to be able to transfer all the storage expansion over to the other one. Now let's move on to the speed of the console, which is actually incredibly shocking, I will say. basically from boot up, just from like a cold turned off, like unplugged from the wall, plug it back in kind of boot up, it's roughly 30 seconds, which is pretty insane. For reference, I have a gaming PC that's $1,400 and it does not boot up as fast. It's maybe like a minute and 15 seconds. So, times are not incredibly different, but it's one of those things that just shows you how much faster the SSD is in these things, even in the small one, because I think they run the exact same SSDs. It's just the difference in the rest of the components, like the CPU, RAM amount, video card, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, speed wise, you're getting pretty much the same thing. I mean, games load incredibly fast. The ones that I've tested, Destiny, Mortal Kombat, you have Halo. When you do it on the internal drive, you can still play it on the external because it's like 120 gigabytes. So I'm sure they already thought about that on taking up pretty much all of your space, because that is one thing that's kind of annoying, is that for certain games that are released on the Xbox One and the Series X, before, if you have an Xbox One, you obviously can't play the upgraded version, so you just play the one they downgraded. Well, when you're playing on a Series S or X, it automatically, as they have that smart delivery thing, it automatically makes you play the Series X optimized one. Obviously, you can't run on an external drive unless it's the one they made for this, so you'd have to transfer it over to your internal before you play. And there is nothing you can do to play it on the old version on the external drive. It has to be the newer version. So that's one thing that can be annoying. I mean, for most people, it's probably not going to matter. As I mentioned, the Series S limits out at 10 games that are Series S and X optimized. So for the most part, it won't really matter. It's only when you're playing those newer games. But eventually, it will become more and more of a problem as pretty much every game released is Series S and X optimized. All right, let's move on to the graphics of this thing. It's kind of, I would say, medium and high quality graphics if you were to compare it to a PC. I wouldn't go as far as to saying low graphics, because sometimes, like a Switch port, for instance, you would notice on things like Mortal Kombat 11, it would come across on the low settings. And I loved the Switch version, so, I'm not saying that to degrade the version or anything. But if you look up gameplay for Mortal Kombat 11 and you search PC low settings, it's almost exactly what it looks like on the Switch. Whereas the Series S, on the other hand, it does have a few frame rate hiccups before the match starts, which is something I noticed on the Switch as well, and I don't know if that happens on the Series X either, but I've noticed on the Switch, the Xbox One, and the Series S, it has that same little hiccup right before the match starts, but then once the match begins, it's 60 frames, smooth, graphics are really good, so it's kind of a weird little hiccup there on all the versions that I've played. And I think they said this one runs on the equivalent of a 1030 3 gigabyte graphics card, which is incredibly outdated. But for a lot of games, it's actually surprising that you don't even recognize it. There are certain PC games that I'm sure if you played with a graphics card like that would just look absolutely terrible, and you probably wouldn't even be able to run them. For instance, I have the GTX 1660, which I think it's either 6 gigabytes or 8 gigabytes of RAM. The VRAM, I'm almost positive it's 6, because usually my games kind of cap out at 4 gigabytes of RAM. VRAM again, I should say. So yeah, having 3 gigabytes is a little bit pulled back, and you will notice it in certain games. Like one of the games that I didn't test for this video was Sea of Thieves. I did test it, I just didn't record it. But you'll notice one of the biggest things is that the visuals look great, but there is a lot of texture pop in. So in order to keep the frame rate high and keep the visuals as they are, you'll notice grass and things in the distance are popping in a lot more than you would notice on like a PC on high settings or something like that. Maybe even more than the Xbox One version, because the Xbox One was running at 30 FPS and a lower visual fidelity. So I think for the Series S, there actually is a little bit more pop in than usual, but you do get higher frame rate and better visuals. So it's one of those things where usually I like higher frame rate, and I'll put a game all the way down to low settings if I have to get high frame rate. So that part doesn't bother me at all. So on that note of graphics and the way games run, I've actually prepared 5 clips to kind of show you what the games look like while they're running. Now, obviously, I'm running it through a video editing program, which kind of lowers the fidelity a little bit, and maybe the frames will be as they were or not, who knows. But this is the general gist of how the games look and run. So first up, you have Fortnite, which is just kind of the obvious choice. It's free to play, so if you buy the Series S or the X and you're like, well, there went all my money, I have nothing else to play, well, bam, there you go. You can download Fortnite. You can test that in the Series S/X. And to no surprise to anyone, the game is incredibly optimized. It actually looks really good comparing it to my computer, what like running at high settings and stuff like that, it looks almost the same. And my graphics card, as I mentioned, is a 1660. So theoretically, my graphics card should be much stronger than this one, but they're able to keep up both in frame rate and visuals. And sometimes, I don't know if the Series S has it, but it looks damn near ray tracing sometimes on the Series S. You'll notice certain lighting elements like the sunset and stuff like that, where just the red looks incredibly vibrant and just lights up the whole mountainside. And then you have, like, as you're dropping in, you'll have a couple texture pop-ins, as I mentioned with Sea of Thieves, but it's one of those things where it's not really that noticeable. And then once you hit the ground, everything's just kind of loaded in properly. I also noticed the textures load in on your character quicker on this than it did on my PC. When I upped the settings, it made it faster, but just running on medium and stuff like that, this one actually runs a lot quicker. So I think the fine line they run with this one, at least on Fortnite, is they probably put view distance down either medium or low, and they just cranked up everything else. They turned it to 60 FPS, maybe 120 on the Series X, I'm not sure. And just like the visuals, cranked that up too. So yeah, it looks incredibly good. Now, as always, the Save the World mode, which I don't have any footage for that, it always runs a little bit worse than the Battle Royale, just because the team, I mean, frankly, let's be honest here, they don't really care about Save the World anymore. So for the longest time on the Xbox One, it was running at 30 FPS. Granted, at least now on the Series S, it does run at 60, but a lot of times when the husks are spawning in, it'll drop down to like 40, 45, and then it'll, kind of jump back up once the storm clouds and tornadoes are gone. But it does still have its dips. The Battle Royale mode, I've noticed, pretty much has no dips. I haven't noticed any frame rate dips, and everything just looks great. Runs great, visuals, frame rate, everything's just firing off there. So no surprise there. Fortnite is very well optimized. Moving on to the next game, we have Resident Evil Village up in the corner there. Now, this is one of those ones where it looks incredibly good. And given Capcom's optimization, sometimes their PC ports aren't that optimized. For instance, Resident Evil 7, I tried playing it on PC, and apparently there's one setting you can turn on. It's like shadow occlusion or something like that. That just completely just tanks your performance, drops it down to like 10 FPS. But they say if you don't do that, then it's fine. But I just went ahead and uninstalled it because I didn't want to have to deal with that. However, the Xbox One version of Resident Evil 7 obviously played great. And then this game, even on the Series S, I mean, it just looks fantastic. It runs at 60 FPS. It has high graphical fidelity. One thing I did notice is that you will have some kind of like off in the distance, like at the very end of the game, not going to go into any spoilers here, but the final boss, there's kind of like trees and vines and stuff like that shaking in the distance. And it does drop to a pretty significantly low frame rate. It's maybe like 10 to 15 frames per second. But those are the ones in the way back. Like the trees in front of you, those are all 60 FPS. And any enemies that are spawning in front of you are also 60 FPS. But it's just one thing I noticed, like all the little creepy vines in the distance, those were kind of moving at a choppy frame rate. And then the only other thing that I noticed was there is in the third area of the game, because the game's kind of broken up into four main areas, the third area is very water-based, and the water is actually really simple. Like there's no frills at all. There's almost no reflection to it. It's just plain water. And I don't really know how to describe it until you've seen it on the Series S, but it's like just the stock, like as lowest of the setting that you can put on water quality, that's what the water is set to. So that is a little bit noticeable. That one's kind of like, it's a little bit jarring. It's a little out of place once you've seen how just amazing the rest of the game looks. Like at the beginning, there's a part where you come and see the village for the first time, and you just see the castle in the distance, and it's like, it looks 4K, even though the Series S usually runs at 1080p or 1440p upscale to 4K, but it looks great. So, kudos there. Capcom usually knows how to optimize their games. And then up next, we have Outriders, which is a game that I'm still on the fence about. I mean, this isn't a review of Outriders, but it's one of those games where it's fun to play, but then you kind of hit a wall, much like Destiny if you played it for long enough, and you're just like, I just don't want to do this right now. I want to play something quick and snappy that I can pick up and put down. But anyway, as far as the game is concerned, there's a very strange thing in the opening cutscene when you first, not in the actual game itself, but just in the intro cinematic when the game's booting up, and it's, it's showing the credits and all the people who worked on it. It has really weird frame tearing, and I have no idea why, because when you actually get into the game, it's incredibly smooth. It has been completely optimized for the Series S. It runs at 60 frames. The visuals look high settings, maybe bordering on very high on certain things. There are some things like certain character models don't look too great. But that one, I don't know how much is to do with the graphical setting and how much is just due to the characters themselves. But they all kind of have like a bland look to them. I don't know what to say there. But the game itself, it runs well, it plays great. There are certain effects that maybe look a little lowered, like maybe to medium settings. But again, as I mentioned, I usually only care about frame rate. So the fact this game is brand new, basically just came out compared to the other games on the list. Well, obviously, Village came out later, but whatever. Based on the other ones coming up, it runs incredibly well for being a new game on the Series S, which, as people have mentioned many times, the technology should be really inferior. Like if you compare the actual specs to a PC or the Series X, it shouldn't run any of these games the way it does. So, you really have to give kudos to Microsoft the way they've been able to optimize relatively old tech. The two biggest changes, obviously, are I think it's the Zen 3 architecture for Ryzen, and then you have the SSD, the Velocity architecture they have. So those two have just carried the graphics card and everything else in here. And again, as I mentioned, it is a $300 console with a controller included. So you compare this to my $1,400 computer, and a lot of the times it's keeping up with it, which is pretty insane. They really packed a lot of power into this tiny little thing. But yeah, Outriders is fun and runs pretty well. There are some games that have been optimized better or worse, but these first three are kind of like the best, I would say, as far as optimization goes. And really all the ones that I chose to do this for, because there are some that, I just don't even have, so I can't really test those. But I tested the ones that I play a lot and that are probably pretty popular. So that was kind of the basis for the ones that I chose today. So up next, speaking of grindy looter shooters, we have Destiny 2, which again, much like Outriders, but to a further extent, because I've played since the beta of Destiny 1. So, I've been in the ecosystem for a while, almost 10 years now, coming up, which is insane to think about. I don't like to think about that. That the end of the whole franchise is coming up soon. Well, the end, I should say. It's going to be the end of the Light and Dark saga. But anyway, moving on. Destiny 2 is another game that runs exceptionally well. That's one of those games that actually first made me kind of switch over to gaming PC for a while, because it was like right at the end of the Xbox One and the Series X had just come out. And I think I waited about 2 months, and then I picked up that it was an $1,100 gaming PC, and then I put in a Ryzen 7 and, swagged out RAM sticks that have RGB. But anyway, Destiny was one of those ones where it was still running at 30 FPS on the Xbox One X. So I was like, I can't do it like this anymore. And I tried it on PC, and it was 60 FPS, 1080p max settings. And I was like, okay, I literally cannot go back and play this Xbox One version anymore. So I just stayed on PC actually for like 2 months until I got the Series S. And yeah, it basically just runs the same. Like if you compare my $1,400 gaming PC to this thing here, which is $300, it runs almost the same. It runs, 1080p or 1440p. I don't know the exact spec it runs at. But yeah, 60 FPS, just near 4K visuals, if not 4K. Because the Series S can do 4K. It's just that most of the time they don't really have the power for it, or they don't have the optimization for it, depending on the developer. So sometimes they can do 4K. So who knows? This one could be 4K. But it looks great. It's a 4K TV, visuals, everything pops. Europa and Nessus are probably the two best looking places. Europa specifically because that was designed when they were, coming out with the Series S and X and the PS5. So I think that was like their first planet where they're like, okay, this is the next gen planet. And it really shows when you play it on next gen consoles or on a high powered gaming PC when they did the upgrade, as you can see in the footage. And the footage that I captured, it's when the sun is kind of low. So it's like, it's a little bit of a gloomy look to it. But when you catch it when the sun is high and there's just like shine coming off all the ice, it changes depending on like time of day and, what kind of storms are going on. But yeah, it just, no matter what kind of weather it is, it looks great. All right, up next, to add some genre variety, and also because I've been playing a lot of Mortal Kombat 11 lately, it is Mortal Kombat 11, as you can see up there in the corner. As I mentioned, there's a little bit of stuttering before the actual fight begins, like when they're doing the intro and like right before it says fight. That's when you kind of notice some weird like frame rate things, but once it actually starts, it runs really well, which is something that the Switch actually did insanely. I don't know what kind of magic they did there, but on the Switch, even in, handheld mode, it still ran at 60 FPS. Granted, as I mentioned, the visuals were set to low, but I mean, the Switch is like, I'll get it to show you. The Switch is this. Look at that. Compare the sizes of these two consoles. This can run at 60 FPS and, medium to high settings, maybe ultra settings, who knows. And then this runs low settings, but still 60 FPS. But look at that. I mean, come on. You compare the size of these two things, and it's insane that it's able to run the way it is. So, NetherRealm Studios is another company that really knows how to optimize. And I've noticed that on the Series S, just everything's great. Speed between rounds, going through the menus, opening the crypt, opening the story, everything just kind of moves along, just like you would expect on the next generation SSD speeds. So, yeah, really not much else to say about the way the games run. I mean, they run great. There really hasn't been many examples. Grounded was another one that I was going to show. That kind of gets an honorable mention here, but because of the fact that it's not a full release, I didn't really want to show that one off because there are still some frame rate dips, but that's, mostly due to the fact that it's not out yet. They're still working on it. Because that's coming from Obsidian Entertainment, which obviously, if you know who they are, they did Fallout New Vegas, which was great. They did The Outer Worlds, which was fantastic, got a sequel. Now, that's another kind of saddening point. On the Series S, there is no FPS boost for the Outer Worlds on the Series S. Now, the Series X does have the FPS boost. It goes up to 60. Sadly, you will still be stuck with the Xbox One version if you're going to play on the Series S. So for me, that's just another game that I'm going to continue to play on the Game Pass for Windows. Which is honestly really cool they do anyway. I do the Microsoft rewards, so all the games are just free, basically. Because I just, I get the rewards, I buy Game Pass with the rewards. When it's time to run out, I fill it up with more rewards, so it just keeps going. So yeah, it's nice that you can, if you have a PC that can run it, a lot of these games you can just play on PC. The Outer Worlds is one of those things where saves don't cross, so you actually can keep two different saves if you want to do it that way, get two different separate achievement sets. But a lot of the games do have cross saves, like you'll have the Master Chief Collection, Gears of War 5 has it. I think a lot of the Bethesda games, I'm not entirely sure. But either way, a lot of crossplay between the Xbox and the PC now. But yeah, that about wraps up the statements on the Series S. I really don't know what else to go over. Kind of talked about the size. The size is very small and nice. The speed is incredible, even compared to a high-powered PC. You have the graphics, kind of a mixed bag, but I will say more than often, it's really good. It's, 1080p, everything runs at 60 FPS. You may have some draw distance issues, but for me, I really care about FPS, and that's about it. So if I can play the new games coming out at 60 FPS, I don't really care too much. I mean, if it looks terrible, then yeah, I'll probably notice that. But a couple hiccups here and there, I don't really mind too much. So if I were to give this a number rating, I really don't know what exactly to knock off points for, because the way it's meant to be made, it is made very well. However, one thing I can knock off for is that I do feel like this one is going to age quicker than the Series X, just because the Series X has like the equivalent, I think they said, of an RTX 2080 or a 2080 Super. I don't even know if that's a card that exists. But either way, when you compare like a 2080 Super or 2060 Super, whichever one it is, to a 1030, graphically they are very far apart. The speeds are pretty much the same, so it really depends on what you're buying it for. So yeah, number grade, if I had to give it one, would be, I would have to say an 8 out of 10. Because there are enough drawbacks on the, certain games not being able to get the FPS boost over the Series X, and just other limiting factors like the storage is kind of a big deal when you have no disk here. There's no disk, a little too high. There's no disk tray here, so when it has only 500 gigabytes, that is kind of a deal breaker for some people. They should have honestly just upped it to 1 terabyte. It may have had to increase the price, but I'm sure a lot of people would have been fine with having, because the PS4, the digital version, it's $100 less and it has no disk drive, but the storage devices are the same size. So there's really no trade-off there. So really, those are the only kind of points that I can knock off. Give it an 8 out of 10. Very solid console. And as I mentioned, it's one of those things where if you can't get the Series X right now, I would just get this. Kind of sit it out, wait until, Christmas, there will probably be another high demand. But it's one of those things where you can just buy it and just hold on to it, play it for the time being. If you do end up getting your hands on a Series X and you don't want this one anymore, you can just sell it, make some of that money back. However, I will point at the audience here, if you sell it, do not scalp it. Be fair to the people trying to buy these. If you buy it for $300, sell it for $300 or $350 if you want to be that kind of person. But don't be that kind of person. Be a little bit that kind of person if you want to get some money back. But don't be one of those people that's like, yeah, Series S, opened, used, $500. Yeah, so that's the review on that. I'll be back with, they added some new skins, which I'm actually pretty excited for in Super Smash Brothers. They have Dante, the Dragonborn. I can't remember what the other one. You have Shantae, and there's another character that I'm blanking on right now, but people are excited to see that one. So anyway, that's it for the review of this pretty great console. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next videos, which should be tomorrow, actually. Probably starting with Dante, because that's the one I'm looking forward to the most.